We were waiting for just a few minutes for Dan and Gordon to come, but I think we can probably go ahead and begin. Welcome, and thank you for coming to the orientation. I'm going to let each of the board members actually introduce themselves because we have a facilitator with us today, and so we will go ahead and have introductions. And Tony, why don't we start with you?
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Tony Walker. I represent the 1st Congressional District on the State Board of Education. I'm mostly from Gary, Indiana, and I'm an attorney up there. Welcome, Chris.
My name is Sarah O'Brien, and I represent the 4th Congressional District. I am a first grade teacher, and I've been on the board for about 4.5 years.
BJ Watts, I'm a 5th grade teacher, 8th Congressional District, and hello, Chris.
I'm Troy Albert. I'm principal at Henryville Junior Senior High School. I represent the 9th District.
Good morning, I'm David Freitas. I represent the 2nd Congressional District. I've been a university professor of education and leadership for about 30 years.
And I'm Superintendent Ritz, and welcome.
Hi, I'm Brad Oliver. I represent the 6th Congressional District and serve as Associate Dean of Education at Indiana Wesleyan University.
I'm Carrie Wicker, and I teach 6th grade language arts at Riverview Middle School in Huntington, Indiana, and I represent 3rd Congressional.
I'm Andrea Neal. I represent the 5th District, and I teach U.S. History and English at St. Richard's Episcopal School.
And we'll have, there's Dan. Dan, just in time, we're introducing ourselves.
I'm Dan Elsner, and I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you. The purpose of the orientation is for professional development for all of us on the roles and responsibilities of the board, the DOE, and the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Professional development on the Open Door Law and Office of Public Access Counselor. We've invited for a presentation later on during the meeting. Reminder that an orientation is strictly limited to the purpose and cannot cover any topics related to board business. And I know that our attorneys will make sure that we comply with that. With the law permitting this orientation. There is no public comment for orientation sessions. And I'd like to introduce our special guest now. From the National Association of State Boards of Education, as you know, Governor Pence invited NASB to help facilitate this orientation, and I really look forward to their assistance with today's work. Chris Amundsen. Great, thank you. From NASB will be the facilitator for today's orientation. Chris, if you would please introduce yourself and anybody that you might have brought with you.
I wish I brought a technology person with me. That's the first thing I'll say. We're going to do this. I'm Chris Amundsen, and I am the relatively new executive director of the National Association of State Boards of Education. Some of you I've had the great privilege and pleasure of meeting last summer at our annual meeting, but for those of you that I haven't met, I'll just give you the 30-second introduction. I'm a former classroom teacher. I taught English, speech, and theater in Minnesota and then in Maryland. Then I worked for the National Association of Elementary School Principals, and then I had the world's most nearly perfect child, and so I started my own business so that I wouldn't have to be out of my house quite so much. I was an education writer for 30 years. I was a member of the Fairfax County School Board, and for those of you who don't know, Fairfax is a very large district outside Washington, and we're bigger than about 7 states. And for my sins, I was the chairman of that board for a couple of years. That was certainly the most politically challenging job I ever had. Then I was elected to the Virginia General Assembly, and you know, I was talking with Superintendent Ritz's chief of staff, and he said, you know, Indiana has a rich tradition and we need to be respectful of that tradition. And I said, let me explain to you that in the General Assembly of Virginia, we still speak about Thomas Jefferson in the present tense. So we get tradition. And then 4 months ago, I came to NASB. I was at a think tank in the middle there and did a variety of things, communications development, and a little bit of policy work. So I am thrilled to be here for a number of reasons. First of all, this may be the only room that I am ever in which there are people who are more fanatical about basketball at the college level than I am. although we could have that conversation later. Second, I am happy to be here because I am so happy that Indiana has rejoined NASB. It's so important for a national voice, and I'll tell you, when I go on the Hill to talk to people about issues relating to education, when I can say we represent, you know, X number of states, that has a big impact. So it's very important, and we're very grateful for having you back. And finally, I have had a number of conversations over the last couple of weeks with people representing the governor's office, your state board staff, the superintendent's staff, and my sense is that everybody is here for the same reason, and everybody, I think, shares the goal of wanting to help the Indiana State Board of Education work as effectively as possible. That's going to be our goal for this morning, and I am going to say to all of my friends here with the cameras on sticks, I'm going to be really boring. So I just want you to know it's going to be a kind of a boring presentation. We're going to do fun things like look at the code of Indiana. So, but what I want to begin with is a little overview on why what you're doing matters so much and why working out policies and procedures is so critically important. I would argue that there has never been a time when the work of state boards of education has been more important in this country, and I think that if anything, the work of state boards is going to get increasingly important over the next few years. You know, we're coming historically out of a cycle that really began with the passage of the first Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now almost 50 years ago. And from that time, with IDEA, with a number of other things, what we saw was increasingly decisions about education were moved from local districts and states to Washington. And I would argue that the Obama administration, through, everybody says it was race to the top, but as a former state legislator, I would tell you that it was really the stimulus money was the single most important thing that they did, because it came right when our budgets were just tanking. But what they did was to stretch out that pendulum swing for a couple more years. But it is now certainly moving back. And whether in the Episcopal Church we talk about sins of omission and sins of commission, and I would say that whether these are acts of omission or commission, power is now moving back to state boards. Acts of commission are things like the waiver process. I have looked at all three of the proposed versions of the rewrite of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, none of which is going to get passed, bye-bye, but if they ever did, all three of them, while they are very different in their approach on many issues, but all three of them place a much greater responsibility for decision-making on states. And then, you know, there are, frankly, some acts of omission. The truth of the matter is, those of us who live in Washington know that it is just not a very happy place right now. They just, you know, it's broken, and they're not doing much. I keep saying to people say to me, what do you think Congress is going to get done between now and the 2014 elections? And my standard response is, well, I imagine they can probably name some post offices. But I am really not looking to them for policy leadership. So that would be okay if we didn't have a need for policy leadership in this country. But, you know, as the PISA results just yesterday showed us, as much progress as we've made, there's still plenty of room for growth, and there's still important work to be done. And so I am here to tell you that the only people in Indiana who are going to largely do that work are probably sitting around this table right now. You all have a huge and outsized responsibility. And that is, and I am struck by the range of decisions that state boards make. You know, I'm sure you knew when the governor called you and told you that this was a one-day-a-month job, yeah, it's always a laugh line for state boards, right? But you probably knew that you'd be looking at issues like curriculum. You probably knew you'd be looking at issues like assessment. You might have been aware that you'd be looking at teacher preparation issues. But did anybody tell you how much time you'd be spending on health issues, or on student discipline issues, or on computer tech? I mean, how did you ever have an idea that you would have to become an expert on bandwidth and connectivity? So the decisions that you make are more important, and they're going to be more wide-ranging. And then, of course, you're also responsible in at least some way for addressing issues around nutrition. And let us never forget, I say every single time I talk about school nutrition, that let's remember that there are many children in this country for whom the school breakfast and school lunch are the only nutritious food that they get all week, right? So all of those are probably not things you thought you were signing on for, but they're things that got piled on your plate. And they are things that are getting piled on the plates of other state board members and across the country. So that is why we're here, is to help you do that job a little better. I do have sort of technology, I don't know, a curse, I guess.
So Chris, if I understand things correctly from what
Yes.
our dialogue was, we're going to be talking about statutory responsibilities. We're going to be talking
I'm
about...
just getting to that, yep.
Okay, the roles of the State Board of Ed as advocate for public education and examples of best practices.
Yes?
And impact of State Board of Education responsibilities on other state agencies.
Yep.
And the role of the State Board of Ed as consensus builder through strategic
Exactly.
planning.
And then a couple of just logistical issues. I thought I would share with you some information from other states. I'm going to suggest to you that that anything, just because it worked one place, is no guarantee that it's going to work another place. But it's helpful, I think, to realize that other people, first of all, people are grappling with all these same issues that you're grappling with, you know? And so it's useful, I think, to share information and thoughts. As I wrote last night, there is no magic wand that anybody can wave that can make this process any easier. And, you know, I'm not sure that they would have let me bring the magic wand through the TSA screening process anyway. But we are the only national organization exclusively devoted to helping state boards of education do your important work. And that's why I'm here. So what we're going to do is first look at, as the superintendent has just said, 4 key roles of school boards. And these were developed in the late, I think, 1980s or very early 1990s, these 4 big roles of school boards. And they were developed by a task, you know, one of the standard sort of task force blue ribbon panels with governors and state board members and all of that. But they've really stood the test of time. So we're going to talk about that first from a theoretical perspective, then we're going to ground it in the always riveting conversations about what does the Code of Indiana specifically say about your responsibilities in this area. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to look at what other states are doing around a number of questions, and then we're going to have a facilitated conversation in which we talk about your sense about the roles and responsibilities in each of these key areas. And I would love to tell you that we're going to walk out of here and have solved all the problems of Indiana education. I think that is unlikely, but this is, I will say, an important precursor to the critical work that you are doing around strategic planning. Because much what you will see over and over again in best practice here is, states do X in relationship to everything from how states build their agendas, to how they create policy, to how they evaluate policy. In successful states, one of the lessons we've learned is that that is tied to the strategic plan, to the mission, to the vision of the board. So the work you are doing, which I think you will begin to really grapple with as a board next month, if I am correct in that, is going to be hugely important. But this work at least will tell you places that you're going to have to build in access points, okay? Yeah.
We're not developing a vision and mission for the board, we're developing a vision and mission for education in Indiana.
Yeah.
There's a difference.
There is a difference, and some boards have both. And
Right. That's why I just wanted to make
yeah,
that.
no. So now it is finally time to turn to the PowerPoint that was the bane of my existence, and we'll see if I can flip. Oh, yeah.
Guys, maybe.
Nope.
You wanna move over here?
Here. All right.
Just what I want to do. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, yeah. So those are the sort of 4 key tasks for the day. Reviewing roles and responsibilities, sharing state best practices, discussing logistical issues, and then laying out some next steps for your board. Okay. Then, if we can go to the next, all right. These are this is taken directly from the Code of Indiana. And these are responsibilities that are assigned to the state board. Maybe we can just move through them fairly quickly because we'll come back to all of them. But you can begin to see that the jobs that you do in the, as a member of a state board are pretty well spelled out in the code. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. And the first key role is as a policymaker. That's probably the one that you all were the most aware of. Now, what we say is that state boards have a responsibility for policies that promote educational quality throughout the state. It is the board's job to define the fundamental mission of the state's education system, so Dan, exactly what you were talking about, and to develop the system's long-range goals. That is the board's responsibility. In order to meet these goals, the board enacts appropriate regulations, lobbies for necessary legislation, develops budgets, and supports local implementation efforts.
Chris, I just want to let everybody know that we're going to get copies of this PowerPoint.
Yes, I'm
so that
sorry.
we don't
You
have
will
to
get copies of the
take
PowerPoint.
copious notes the whole time.
Yeah. Now, as we all know, state boards are not the only ones charged with making educational policy. The state superintendent has responsibilities that are laid out in the code. The governor has the ability to, through executive action and through appointments and through other issues, the governor has power. And God love them, and I say this as a former state legislator, sometimes they want to swim in your lane as well, but they have a tremendous responsibility for education, partly because anything you do is eventually going to be appear in the state budget. And that is the responsibility of the state legislature. All righty, we'll hope it's working now. But so what does policymaker look like in Indiana? And we're going to turn this over to your attorney. Yes.
Okay, so this presentation is designed to look specifically at the statutes that apply to the State Board of Education in Indiana. And I'll have a few references to the statutes that reference the Superintendent of Public Instruction or the Indiana Department of Education, because as you will see, there are frequently coordinating roles. I want to be really clear that this is a high-level review. I was told to try to keep it to 15 minutes, which is really hard to do when you have dozens of statutes that apply. So it is not exhaustive, and I highlight some statutes, but I do not want that to be taken in any way to be some sort of judgment that they're more important than the other responsibilities. I was honestly selected some of these because they are good examples of the coordinating roles between the board, the department, and the superintendent of public instruction. And I know that we've sent them to you all before, but we do have comprehensive lists of the applicable statutes, and we have them in hard copy as well if you'd like a hard copy version of that. Chris just covered some of these, but these are the general duties that are set out for the board under 2019-214. Again, establishing the educational goals of the state, assessing the attainment of those goals, assuring compliance with established standards and objectives, making recommendations to the governor and general assembly concerning the educational needs of the state, including financial needs. And I'm not going to be offering a whole lot of commentary about these or characterizing them. I thought that for the purpose of an orientation, the aim would be to just get the black and white statutes up on the screen. Here, I have provided a list of categories of responsibilities that fall under the State Board of Education. All of the various statutes you can generally fit under these kind of qualitative categories, if you will. They are various in nature, but the board has some sort of responsibility in all of these categories, as well as the next slide. You can see accountability, accreditation, what we all are familiar with ADM, AP courses, operations, CT, charter school sponsors, standards, compulsory attendance, curriculum-related responsibilities, freeway schools. I won't read this to you because you can see it. And here are yet more, including special education, teacher licensure, teacher evaluation, remediation. In addition to, or within those statutory responsibilities are rulemaking responsibilities. So sometimes when I say that the board has a responsibility in, say, teacher evaluation, teacher licensure, that responsibility is actually a rulemaking responsibility where we promulgate the administrative rules, and many of you have lived through that lengthy process, and it's an important one where we have the public hearing and gather public input. And the rulemaking authority for the board falls under Title 511 of the Indiana Administrative Code. And again, trying to remind that we have coordinating roles. The department also has rulemaking responsibility, and that falls under Title 512. So these are distinct roles and functions between the board and the department. I have some example areas of rulemaking responsibility. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list, so please don't interpret it to be one. I just wanted to throw some areas up where the responsibility on the board includes the rulemaking, which we know the regulations have the impact of law, and there's a thorough review process that happens with the Office of Attorney General, who has to sign off on all rulemaking before it goes to the governor for signing and before it becomes effective. Here, teacher licensure is certainly an important one. Alternative education, accountability. We really have two areas of rulemaking when it comes to accountability. The metrics themselves, and now we have three types of metrics. We have the traditional A to F metrics that will apply to all schools generally, and then we have alternative education metrics that we have been tasked with promulgating, and then we have metrics for students with disabilities. So as Chris mentioned, we have a big year ahead of us with really significant responsibilities that fall falling under the rulemaking responsibility that's been statutorily granted to the board. Additionally, the other piece of that I say kind of falls under accountability is the rulemaking responsibility that applies to what we know as turnaround academies. Those are all schools that reach that 6th year of the lowest category designation. And we currently have an administrative rule that applies to those. Standards for students personnel. Oh, sorry, that's duplicative. I have standards twice. The criteria upon which the department may make arts education grants. We have assessment authority for assessment rulemaking and accreditation rulemaking. So again, not an exhaustive list, but hopefully this is illustrative of the breadth and scope over which the state board has rulemaking responsibilities. I want to just highlight a few, and again, this is not a judgment that these are in any way more important. I'm just tried to pick a few areas where the board, the department, and the superintendent all have different responsibilities. One of those areas falls under assessment. Here, the state board authorizes the development and implementation. The state superintendent is responsible for the development and implementation after that authorization. And then the department prepares the detailed design specifications for the ISTEP program. And as you all know, we've been able to hear from Michelle Walker and previously Wes Bruce. Those are the people who work hard on doing that design specification for our assessment systems. Additionally, there are different responsibilities when it comes to standards, adoption, and development. I highlighted some areas, but I've just thrown the statutes up to provide an example of how each different entity has unique responsibility when it comes to the standards, adoption, and development process. This slide, similar to assessment, we have statutory responsibilities that are distinct of the rulemaking piece that fall under accountability and assessment. This is really under the accountability piece of the code, the article that applies to accountability. But as you can see, it integrates the role of the board in adopting or approving assessments. Because when it comes to developing the metrics for the A to F system and what counts towards those, you can see that the state board
administering the counts that are due. So when schools report their attendance on the certain days required to by statute or by rule, then a corresponding amount is determined for those schools for attendance, tuition support, and the like. Teacher licensing, we monitor teachers. We receive all complaints, whether they're substantiated or not, from the Department of Child Services. So if a teacher is named, or if an event occurred at a school or related to a school function, we are notified of any what's called a 311, which is the report that's generated when there's an allegation of child abuse or neglect. We maintain a database of those, and some are made public and some are not. If we do find that a teacher has been charged and convicted of certain offenses, then we can proceed with the superintendent's power to terminate that teacher's license. Or if a teacher is accused of some sort of malfeasance or neglect or dereliction of duty, then we can also proceed for probation to have a probation license or to suspend a teacher's license for a period of time. Ultimately, the board makes the final decision once that the hearing takes place. Teacher contracts, the superintendent is charged with designing and administering or releasing a form contract or model contract for certain teacher contracts, those being the regular teacher contract, the substitute teacher contract, supplemental aids contract, and we have done those schools are required to use those without alteration for the individual teacher contracts. Data collection and monitoring, the department is the clearinghouse for most data that comes in from schools, whether that be ISTEP scores, student enrollment, special education council, those kind of things. The department is responsible for maintaining the data and being the clearinghouse for those. The department and the superintendent designed the diploma form. We also publish and create a form for schools to submit their annual performance reports, which are due yearly. In fact, with the Seclusion Restraint Commission that's working right now, that will probably be modified to include the number of allegations or any incidences involving either seclusion or restraint. The department does have rulemaking authority, as Michelle indicated. under Rule 512, and we have implemented rules recently, emergency rules with regards to the Choice Scholarship Program. We do monitor the Choice Scholarship Program for student eligibility. We process all applications. We notify families when they are awarded a Choice Scholarship and the amounts, and then we distribute the checks to the schools. We also monitor schools and do audits by statute of a certain percentage of schools each year to ensure that those schools are maintaining compliance with the requirements to keep certain paperwork, which establishes the child's eligibility for the choice program. We also are charged with monitoring schools to ensure if they fall in the bottom two categories of category placement, that being a D or F, then we are able to suspend new students from enrolling in those schools, or if a school size doesn't grow above 30 students in size for the category for that size. So with that, I think I will conclude.
Mike, quick question.
Yeah.
Over what educational issues does the superintendent of public instruction have policy-making authority outside of the state board?
I think that probably goes beyond the orientation session today, and because we've kind of agreed to keep that limited, I'm not going to answer that question for you today, unfortunately.
Well, that's talking about the roles and responsibilities, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there any statute that you're aware of that gives the superintendent of public instruction policy-making authority over education issues outside of the state board?
Yeah, again, I think that falls into beyond the scope of orientation session today.
Well, I
So
disagree with that.
I'm unable to answer that question
I
for you.
disagree with that because it's particularly germane to what we're talking about. I'm just asking, are you aware of a statute? So that can be a simple yes or no.
I respectfully disagree. I think that falls within the category of beyond
Are you
orientation.
aware?
So.
Again, I have the exhaustive list of statutes, and I will say that the board is the entity that has the statutory language about setting policy, and I don't see that
That's
in
all
other
right.
locations.
That
Right.
should be clear. I'm glad you made the point, because we've already read through these. So the policy authority is here, Tony.
You can look to the list of statutory authorities that were given to the superintendent. They're available in code, and you have a copy as well. So, with regard, she is the chief education officer of the state. So that will be left for another meeting. For today, I think that goes beyond the scope of orientation.
Well, since you're here, and maybe Michelle's the better person to answer this, but I'll bring it up. Because one of the statutes that really didn't get highlighted that's important, I think, is that as part of the statutory scheme, there's a provision that makes the superintendent of public instruction the chairperson of the State Board of Education, correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware of any statutes or other case law, regulations, rules, which define what the powers and authorities of that chairmanship are?
Of that particular chairmanship?
Yeah.
I do not know of any statute with respect to that particular chairmanship other than what's in 2019.
Is there a definition?
She is the chair of the board. There
Yeah,
are
is there-
certainly chair definitions in other sections of the code that very clearly define the roles of the chair. And I think those, as an attorney, you should be aware of those as well.
So, just so I'm clear, so we have the statute saying the superintendent is the chair. Are you aware of any other statutes which define the roles of the chair as it relates to the State Board of Education?
As it relates to State Board of Education, you have an exhaustive list of those in print. And so off the top of my head, I don't have them memorized, so I can't answer that question, unfortunately. Again, I think that's beyond the scope of what I would call an orientation, which is just to instruct you all of your roles and responsibilities as public officers. not
Yeah, I
necessarily
couldn't find
particular
one, so I was
officer.
just wondering if maybe you all did a more exhaustive study if you found one.
Not for this orientation session, that wasn't the purpose. So like I said, the purpose of an orientation by statute in the open door law is to orient the members of a public agency as to their roles and responsibilities. So as to yours roles and responsibilities, I think we've highlighted those.
So are you suggesting that the superintendent is not a member?
She is a member.
So she's being oriented as well? right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, to the extent that I can be helpful, I think that it's within the purview of the orientation to outline what is in the statutes that apply to the board, because it's roles and responsibilities. And the answer, the only statute that I have seen, and I created these documents, so I think I'm pretty familiar with what's in them, is the one statute that Michael mentioned under 2019 that does designate the superintendent of public instruction to be the chair. But otherwise, the statutes are silent in terms of process or defining the responsibilities. That's unlike the statute that designates that there shall be a secretary on the board and does list what those responsibilities are when you are secretary to the State Board of Education.
So it bears, really, this orientation, if it has any value, would be to communicate to the public when we have TV here. The board is to make policy. We don't create policy in the department, they implement it. That's clear in the statutes, it's clear today. And it's clear that the board chair is just designated, and we have to make rules, how the chair behaves and what goes on, and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. We need to come to agreement with that. And so that's not by statute, that's our responsibility. And that's been a little muddy, I think, in some statements, and that makes it clear today, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I do want to be really clear that since this was an orientation session and not an open meeting in the legal sense, I mean, it's open, we have folks here, we open the doors, but notice wasn't posted 48 hours in advance and it wasn't designated as a meeting. We can't take any action, and action is defined really broadly under the open door law. It includes even receiving information. So we can't even discuss or talk about agenda setting or board operations and procedures in that sense. And I do apologize, as you know, I repeatedly recommended that this be an open meeting so that we could get into those topics.
But that makes another point. It's very unfortunate. Very unfortunate. A number of board members asked the chair to put this notice out 48 hours so it'd be an open meeting, and the chair just refuses.
This is beyond the scope.
Yeah, I think that at this point we probably should be careful on tiptoeing into procedures. I sent an email last night where I said we start having some fine lines on what we can and cannot talk about, and I certainly don't want to limit conversation because we need to have those substantive discussions, but I also don't want us to violate open door law. So having those talks, we probably have to wait until the meeting on the 20th. I can't talk. The open meeting on the 20th.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Chris, do you need help getting that back on your presentation? I think Laura's coming.
So, what I did, and I hope this complies with open meeting law, but when it is time for the conversation, and whether that is today or in your meeting on the 20th, I think among the questions that you should be, grappling with are, first of all, do all of the policy actors, and you heard, I didn't know you had a school bus committee, for example, do they have a clear idea of what their roles are? And do those policymakers work together in relative harmony? Second, does every time you consider new policy, and the answer to this I'm fairly sure is going to be no, but hopefully after January won't be. Do new policies relate? Are you very intentional about relating new policy development to your strategic plan? And then third, and this is also an important task, and Michelle and I talked about it as well, that once, just adopting policy is not enough. The board does create policy, the department implements, but then the board has a review process as well. And in States that I think we should be looking at as models, there is a regular cycle of reviewing existing board policies so that the board can be aware of how it's being implemented, where people are bumping their heads, what the concerns are. And if you, I guess, I don't, I'll leave it to the lawyers to tell us whether when we get to the open discussion part we can talk about all of this, or whether I simply leave you with these questions and you know that that's your homework for the next time. All right. Now, we talked about that as a second role. A second and really important role for state boards is as an advocate for education. You really are the key, you have the responsibility for being the advocate about what the needs of schools in Indiana are. And your job is in part to make recommendations to the governor and to the General Assembly about the educational needs of the state, including financial needs. That's always a dicey process. Some state legislators listen better than others, I would say, and I can say that having been one. Here, I think the questions that it is important for your board to begin to consider are, how do you use public time? I think public time at state board meetings is one of the great untapped resources for state boards. If you really are about advocating for excellence in education, then part of your public time at every board meeting ought to be highlighting what that looks like. What do we mean by all kids? What do we mean by excellence? And if you are not using public time at your board meetings, which you attract a crowd, you might as well take advantage of that. So that is one of the, and I don't see boards anywhere doing that particularly well. Can I just be very honest about it? Second, and this is a second, I think, very difficult issue. And boards, I will assure you, across the country are grappling with this. Does your board have a policy that helps you know who gets to speak for the board and when and under what circumstances? Laughing. Yeah, that's the general reaction. I would say that this is perhaps an area on which we could mark a big N for needs improvement across the board for state boards, but it's important because you don't lose your First Amendment rights when you come on the board, but on the other hand, once the board acts, you have some responsibility. Yeah,
Going
Andrea.
back to the public time, I think the public testimony piece of that is really critical, but what I've noticed, and I've only been on the board since July, is that it's almost pro forma. We listen, we're done. I think some ideas that come out of the public testimony need follow-up.
Well, let me start to write. I'm going to start to write some things on the board. I mean, we're going to have a facilitated discussion, but let me write that because I think that is a really good suggestion. And the whole question of public testimony.
Chris, I'll be glad to have someone else write if you would prefer.
Sure, that'd be fine. But
Claire, do you want to write? Okay.
sure.
And I would include in that not both direct feedback follow-up as well as policy feedback.
Yeah,
I
right.
think we ought to, maybe we do it. I think we ought to send a thank you note to everybody who testifies. I think we ought to make sure they've got contact information so they can send, a lot of times they don't get it all out, and we need to get emails of their entire
Right.
statement, even if they get cut
Yeah,
off.
right. Well, I think for people to come to a State Board of Education meeting can be kind of a scary, process. I certainly, having sat through thousands of hours of board hearings, I know that just the fact that I used to look at people and smile at them when they were talking was something that I was told on many occasions how grateful they were, because you would see people, you know, coming up to the dais and they were just shaking. You don't think you're scary, but you can be. And so I think that is a hugely important part of what you do. And the whole process of managing, in whatever way you can, public testimony is something that I think is just, you know, you really need to work at it. And then in this era of social media, how, you know, are you going to do electronic? I mean, what are you going to do to bring in all those people who aren't going to come to conference room B, but who would like to participate on Twitter? And, you know, some of that's going to be governed by what your lawyers tell you can and can't do anyway. So I think those are key issues, and we should put that on as an idea for follow-up, because I think it's important. The third key responsibility, is liaison. And you heard, here is an area where it is very clear to me, even from the cursory description that we got from the two attorneys. The superintendent has some very specific and designated liaison responsibilities. The board has other specific liaison responsibilities. And so yours, among other things, include coordinating with the Commission for Higher Education. And that may include, you know, sharing data and creating high school feedback reports and all of those kinds of things that, you know, if they haven't come yet, they're coming. You know they are. So the questions there that I have are, one, does your board have a formal approach for how you reach out to other key policymakers in the education space? Lyndon Johnson used to say the time to make friends is before you need them. In Colorado, the local school boards association has a formal liaison to the state board, and I am not sure, I didn't have time to find out last night, whether that person actually sits at the board table, but that person comes and is called on for expert testimony and operates in a sort of ex officio role, does not have a vote, but does have a coordination responsibility. Many state boards have formal meetings with, you know, prior, in this month of December, generally, before the General Assembly or the legislature comes into town. Do you have a formal meeting with the chairs of your education committee and the chairs of your budget committee? Because you should. Because I will assure you that even as we speak, busy legislators are sitting in their offices in their home districts, writing things that they think you should be doing. And it would be nice for them, A, to tell you, and B, even more importantly, to listen when you say, you know, that's not such a good idea. The other, you know, the other thing that I would suggest to you is that you do begin to think about formalizing some of those relationships with other agencies. And I'll just give you one because it's not controversial particularly, but it's going to be big, and that's health. At the federal level, the Centers for Disease Control has just had a shift in how they want to manage health policy in schools. And so it's going to come out of state departments of education everywhere and going to go into state departments of health. And a doc took over is what happened at CDC. Went from being a public health person to being a doc, and so docs tend to want to deal with the health department. But that's going to have a big impact on your work, because whereas before the health person who was funded by CDC probably sat somewhere in the Indiana Department of Education, that is not going to happen anymore. So there will be much more, and it'll probably be different people. One of the things that we have already begun to do at NASB, for example, to prepare for that, is to revise our book that we call How Schools Work and How to Work with Schools. Because we know we're going to be dealing with 50 states worth of brand new people doing health policy in schools, and they're probably not going to have any idea of how you operate. So I'll just give you that because it's not contentious. It's not going to be controversial in the same way that, you know, issues like Common Core are, but it's going to be big because health issues are huge, and it is going to come right square on your heads. So get ready, it's coming. All right, and so we've gone through the liaison responsibilities. And then finally, we get to consensus builder, and I would suggest that may be why I'm here, in part. The code is not really, the Code of Indiana is kind of silent on what your responsibilities are for building consensus. And, you know, people come on this board and you have strong opinions. You had them, which is why you got here in the first place, and you still got them. And this is a place where you need to, you know, hash them out. And it's hard, and it's hard work, and it's real work. And that's what I'm going to say to you. But it is also important, and there are some things that you can do. One is, I think you can look at, and I stop me, Michelle, if I'm coloring outside the lines here, but development of agendas is a way that we find that state boards can help themselves build consensus. So, you know, you ask questions like, what are your long and short-term goals? Again, getting back to your strategic plan. When are you next going to evaluate and review the board's progress? What do you have a process for addressing new issues? And then those are some just sort of definitions of good board agendas. And the last quote is from a NASB publication. Boards should have a clearly defined process for developing the agenda with specific criteria for adding items unrelated to the board's objectives to the agenda. The board must be adamant, I love that word, adamant in adhering to your process if you're going to avoid an equivocal approach to policymaking. So if you don't have a formal process for agenda development, our suggestion would be you need one. Here is what Michigan does. There's a committee, and it includes the state board executive, the superintendent, 4 deputy supes. I want you to know this is their words, not mine. And then there is a board agenda subcommittee that consists of the board chair, the board vice chair, the board secretary, and any other board member who wants to participate. And that's an open process. That's an open meeting. So I just offer that up to you. Doesn't, you know, as I say, it is an approach that I had not seen before, and so I will share that with you. Now I think it is time for us to move to the facilitated discussion portion of the program. And that is, we have thrown, and I know that we've thrown a lot of information at you, some of which you knew. And you know, people who have been on the board for a while, like Dan, this is probably a review and maybe not, you know, the most useful thing, but at least everybody now has some common ground. And what I think the most useful thing for us to do for the next period of time is to talk about the 3 or 4 big roles. How are you doing in your role as policymaker? How are you doing as a liaison, as an advocate? What are your procedures for building consensus? And, you know, what is your work to come? What are the things you need to do? So I am happy to facilitate. I think that was supposed to be my job, was to kind of guide the conversation, which I will, and I will try to keep people kind of on task, but knowing that the lawyers are going to whack me if we don't.
And we do have in our schedule a 15-minute break. Do you want to take your question first and before we start this process, or
maybe we should take the break and then come back
with our questions?
Because I think the questions that conversation might go a little long. I'm completely at the pleasure of the board.
My question is
Go ahead,
regarding the
Sarah.
conversation that we're proposing coming back to have. So,
Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Then you should certainly ask it, Sarah.
I don't want to speak for the board, but given the design of the meeting today as an orientation instead, I'm highly uncomfortable, given open door and public perception, the fact that this was not posted. I'm a little uneasy with having a conversation about procedures, especially given that, our roles, given that a lot of the procedures and roles we haven't been able to have a conversation on. I worry about that blurred line there, which obviously I defer to the attorneys as well. By no means do I necessarily want to have a fourth meeting in December, but I feel fairly strongly that the conversation has to take place before we meet on the 20th. We have some real business at hand that needs attention immediately. Again, it wouldn't be preferred, but I feel strongly that we need to have an open meeting with notice sent 48 hours in advance to have clearly defined procedures, to understand how our agenda is set, to have all of that in place. I feel strongly that needs to happen according to the law the way that it is written. So I don't want to speak for everyone, and I'm not even sure if it's possible for us to approach this right now given the status of this meeting, but I would just like to publicly state that I'm uncomfortable given the way that it's designed.
Well, I do have good news. Yesterday, I had indicated that our public access counselor, Luke Britt, had a different conference he had to attend, but he was kind enough to be here today. So we do have the public access counselor here who can flag us if we're starting to get into improper territory. And so I think that we'll have very clearly set parameters.
Is it possible, though, for us to, again, call a meeting before the 20th? I feel like if we wait to discuss this during our meeting on the 20th, we won't have ample time to get through the meat of what needs to be discussed. Not ideal, but I don't know a better way. I feel like it needs a genuine conversation throughout this board to take place prior.
In my mind, that's just something that the board members with the director and Davis could have a conversation about in terms of setting yet another meeting during the month of December when semesters are ending and holidays are coming. Certainly, you have the legal authority to have another meeting, and it would just be about arrangements, et cetera.
How do you do an emergency meeting?
Under the procedures that were adopted in May of 13, an emergency meeting is permissible if 3 board members request it, and there has to follow the normal rules of 48 hours of notice.
I just had a basic comment, and we can do this after the break, but Chris, we are streaming, and for the general public, at some point, could you just give a brief overview of what NASB is and the role it plays with state boards and the affiliated groups?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, and maybe we do that right after a break, but yes.
And I had the same concern as Sarah, and I'm not an attorney, I don't have that background. I was one of the people who asked for an open meeting, so before we start, I would love to hear some boundaries set by the public access counselor on what are inbound conversations. Because I don't want to inadvertently violate it by getting into the spirit and the flow of the discussion and find out I just stepped over the line.
No. You know what, if I could suggest a process, then it might be to take the break right now, to take a short break. We can lawyer up the public the public access counselor can come back and help you understand at least the parameters of what conversation you could have, and then you could make a decision, because it might be that you would feel that you had sufficient latitude to talk about the things you felt like you needed to talk about today and still stay inside the boundaries of the statute.
And
So that would be my process suggestion, would be to take the break now to give people a chance to kind of talk about that, and then we'll come back with a presentation from the public access counselor.
Yeah, Chris, I was going to say that that's a good suggestion, and we can go ahead and have the public access presentation, and that might be able to give us a format in which to perhaps continue.
Sure.
Thank you.
If that's all right with the board,
Let's
then
take
I
a
think you all
15-minute
need
break.
to make that
15
call.
minutes. So we'll resume at 10:30. Yeah, if we could go ahead and have a seat.
Okay. Sounds good.
I want to welcome Luke Britt to our orientation on Open Door Statute and Office of Public Access Counselor. Thank you so much, Luke, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Superintendent. Thank you for having me this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to as many public agencies as I can, and certainly it's a pleasure to be here. I do have kind of a canned presentation that I usually go over, but since all of that material isn't necessarily relevant to the issues facing the board, I'll deviate from that. Plus, you probably don't want to hear me lecture for an hour about this. Please, I don't know what my time limitations here are, but I would like this to be more of a dialogue than just a talking to. So if you have any questions as I move forward, please don't hesitate to stop me, interrupt me, and I'll try to help you out the best I can. Now, one of the reasons why we're here today, is, as you're all aware, is to have kind of an orientation meeting of the board. And that is one of the exceptions in the open door law that isn't defined as a quote-unquote meeting as determined by the legislature when they were going about putting together the open door law. So now the way I interpret orientation is not necessarily the commencement of the agency, like the first day on the job or the first day in office, something like that, but also to mean a reorientation of roles and responsibilities. So to kind of gather the troops, to reestablish what the purpose of the board is, what the individual members mean to the collective of the board, what are your roles and responsibilities as members. And so that's why when Michelle and I were talking about whether this meeting was appropriate or not, that was my view on it, that I could see from some previous issues that have been brought before me and some of the previous opinions I write, that it may have been appropriate for the board to gather to do that reestablishment effort and to come together for a discussion about those specific roles and responsibilities. But keep in mind that that's a very, very, very narrow definition, and even by my own definition, that's going to be important going forward, that we stick to those roles and responsibilities and not delve into any kind of policy or procedure or any kind of, especially any kind of final action for the remainder of the meeting. We want to make sure that we stay on that orientation topic, because notice wasn't given as mandated by the open door law. So
I just want to make sure I understand. So
Yeah.
we have the media here, we're streaming, the public here, but somehow we're still not open. And we're not open or complying with open door law solely because we didn't post a 48-hour notice, or what?
Because it's not defined as a meeting, technically that notice wasn't required. So this isn't an open meeting.
So but
by
the
having
reason
the
why we can't have any official action is because the notice, is it just because the notice wasn't posted?
That's
48
correct.
hours?
If
Okay.
notice was posted 48 hours and it complied with all the, the laundry list of notice requirements, then, discussion could commence on any number of topics. Yeah.
Can you discuss hypotheticals?
No, because that would open up a discussion toward, for other things. And since you guys are majority, obviously, here, then that would go outside, what is meant by orientation.
And can you discuss ideal
Ideal?
practice?
Only when it comes to the roles and responsibilities of the board. Yes.
So would that include agenda setting, ideal agenda setting practice?
I would caution against that. Yeah, I would encourage that to be in an open meeting for agenda setting.
Are we allowed to ask questions of each other?
No, because again, that would be a discussion, a deliberation between the members, and that would need to be open as well. Yes.
I have a question about who determines whether or not to have an open meeting. Virtually all of us wrote to the state superintendent asking that this be an open meeting within certainly 48 hours. And those requests, I know I wrote, I have not still received a response to probably 100 emails that I've sent forward. So my question is, if the board wants to have an open meeting and the state superintendent does not, what does open meeting say about that? Can we get together before the meeting, and if 3 of us, like the emergency rules, say we can have an emergency meeting, can 3 of us get together and say we want an open meeting? How does that work according to the law?
Sure, let me be clear about this, that any action of the board as a whole would only apply if there was a majority. So there are 10 members plus the chairwoman, correct?
Correct.
So that would be 6 members. If 6 members got together, that would have to be in an open setting. If 3 members got together and wanted to present an idea to the chairwoman or to one other member, something like that, that would be appropriate because it wouldn't be a quorum, it wouldn't be a majority. It's only if 6 or more members got together, had a discussion, and then brought that to the table, that would be inappropriate. That would.
Let me ask the question a different way because you really didn't answer it. The question is, who determines to have an open meeting? Can 3 of us request that an open meeting be held and therefore it would be posted and follow the open meeting law?
Yes, you can request that for sure. Now, who makes that determination? I don't know. I haven't read your bylaws. The open door law doesn't contemplate agency procedures, for example. So it doesn't set rules for meetings. It doesn't set parliamentary procedures, anything like that. So as far as the actual operational nature of the board and those actions, those would be on the scope of the open door law.
Short of the statute, which is silent on this issue, we heard earlier that the roles and responsibilities of the chair are not defined by statute.
Right.
Therefore, if the law is silent on this issue, then how do we know how to proceed with this?
Well, that would be something that would maybe included in a set of bylaws, for example. I don't know if you have those.
We would need to meet and set our own bylaws as a board and to have that stated what that process is.
In the open,
and as
correct.
long as that's stated and voted upon by the board,
yes,
then that would be in compliance with open meeting law.
Yes, if it's
I
on an
might
open
add some clarity, at least from my point of view. I had a conversation with the governor, and the governor and I said that we thought the best forum to begin to build relationships was to have an orientation. And so, from my perspective, I'm simply doing what it is that the governor suggested to me in our private meeting. And so, there's no intent from me in any way to do anything other than to have an orientation, to begin our dialogue about issues, and there's nothing else to it. It's that simple. So, from my perspective, I just want to
Approach it in a spirit of bipartisanship,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
That is a good question, and Tennessee is, I think, is another place where that has sort of happened. And I am very interested in spending some in-depth time with the folks in Massachusetts and Mara, who is their chair, and I have had conversations about that. That is likely to happen in the early new year, but I would say a couple of things. One, there was a commitment. The state board adopted, I think, generally a set of principles of we are going to do the following things. We are going to raise standards for all kids. By all, we mean all. We are going to increase the rigor of our curriculum, and they had a real rigorous commitment to testing and evaluation as well. That is something I have heard former Governor Jane Swift, who is a Republican, talk very favorably about that approach. The current governor, Governor Patrick, also speaks very favorably about that approach. I think the 2 things that the board did were, one, there is tremendous public involvement. There is a Massachusetts Business Council for Good Education. That's not its name, but it's close. And if you Google that, you'd find it. Lyndon Noonan is their executive director, is how you'll know you got to the right page. And they have held the board's feet to the fire. So that when the first set of test scores came in, and they were lousy, they were not good. And the approach in Massachusetts was, this is really good news. This is really good news. Because we're giving people straight information. And so they stayed the course. And Massachusetts and Maryland have made both more progress measured by the NAEP, which is, the only kind of national thing we got, than any other state. And both of them are showing significant decreases in, I think, what we should all be worried about, right, which is those achievement gaps, those persistent achievement gaps. And Massachusetts, Maryland, and Tennessee are places where that's really happening. But it's probably, you gotta be really honest when the first results come back, and they're bad, and they're gonna be, and you say, you know what? This is good. This is good news. Yeah.
I'm going to have to start with my final question. I'm making an assumption, and I've noticed our board in the past, when we were most effective, had a very clear plan and goals.
Yep.
Is it your observation around the country, really, my colleague here kind of was a great question to follow up, and I heard that the adherent, create a plan, commit to a plan, publicize a plan, and work the plan. Discipline to some high aspirations transcends cheap little political battles and all that. If you get to the real core,
Yep.
doing something great for your state.
Yep. I would say the only thing I would add to that is then you have to continually review and measure yourself against. Because if all you do is adopt the plan and then go out and talk about it,
No.
that is not enough.
It's
So
the
as
process
a
of
very
Discipline.
disciplined, I would say discipline is the key. You set the goals, you set ambitious goals, and then you discipline yourselves to make sure that the policies you adopt are congruent with those goals, and that you, when you evaluate everything down to, how are we using public comment registration, should be evaluated, and I'm just picking that because it's the last thing on your list, but everything should be evaluated in terms of, is this helping us achieve these
I
sort of...
appreciate your input. We had, by the way, we had an all-day session yesterday with the
right.
strategic planning
Right.
committee, and we're heading down that path, and I hear your affirmation. That's
I think
the
it's
place to
very
be.
important. I think, yeah, but it is not easy, and it means that when the latest wild hair story appears in the paper about some teacher who assigned some novel that somebody didn't like or something, you don't let yourselves get all wrapped around the axle on that.
Well, that doesn't happen in Indiana.
Oh, well, yes. They only.
That's what's understood. Thank you for
I
your
wish
input.
that had been the case in Virginia, because it's certainly.
And Chris,
Yeah.
with Dan saying that he needs to leave, we did talk about this kind of ending at noon. So
It's fine. I think my last comment to you then would be, I feel like you did good, hard work today. And I want to compliment you. I want to compliment everybody. As I said in the beginning, my sense was that people are really hungry to make this board work. I leave here, and that is still my belief, that there is no one in this room who does not want this board to be a success. And that's good, because frankly, whether your board is a success or not is of much less import than whether Indiana public education is a success for all kids. And because what you do is so important, you have to make this work. Now, it is my understanding that as part of that strategic planning process, you might see my smiling face again. I hope so. I will also invite you, I do get my 30 seconds of commercial, the National Association of State Boards of Education. We are running a number of wonderful professional development opportunities next year. We have sent them to, I don't know who we sent them to, but We have a legislative conference coming up in March if you are interested in legislation. We have our annual meeting coming up next October, and that will be in Denver. And those are rich opportunities for professional development. I think we will very likely be running some workshops even in states, so watch our website, because there may be an opportunity for us to bring a workshop on deeper learning or something to Indiana that you could share, for example, with local boards. We are, as I said, happy to have you back in the fold, and we need you, and we hope to see you all again. And as I say, for better or worse, I think you will see me again. So thank you for your very, very hard work.
Chris, before you leave, just for the viewers that are streaming us, could you just briefly say what NASB is and what their role is relative to state boards?
Sure. We are the National Association of State Boards of Education, and we are the only national organization that, we are a membership organization, and we are the only national organization that focuses on education policy from the perspective of providing support, information, and training to members of state boards of education. And that's why I got to come here.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you publicly for getting involved with our board, and I'd also like to thank publicly the governor and the superintendent for agreeing to have your participation. I think it's been a very helpful session for us, and I hope that we can continue to work with you as we try to implement what we're trying to do here. And then I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the superintendent for meeting with me one-on-one last week. I thought we had a very good discussion, so thank you for taking the time, and I'll yield back to Jeff.
I want to follow up because earlier in the meeting, Sarah mentioned her concerns. We did have the opportunity, and I appreciate them being here to kind of keep us in check. Do you feel comfortable with where we're at in the discussion? I guess we aren't really supposed to ask, am I allowed to ask for that question? I mean, you talked about an emergency meeting. Do you feel comfortable that we've talked about this thoroughly? Can we review it at the beginning of the next meeting in a way? Is this the same? Okay.
My thought is, I thought this morning, yesterday, very, very, very good. Today I thought was very, very, very good. I think we're right here to get to that point, but I don't think we're there yet. So my comment would be, I think we're a meeting away from having all this ironed out and then being able to jump into it.
And that's why I didn't want to just say, okay, we're done, and we all go home, and now we're all home wondering what happens next.
Throw something at me if I get on the line here. I think another meeting is needed. That strictly my thoughts and my comment, because I feel like things are moving in the right direction. Yesterday, our conversation was so productive, and I thought the light was on. It's the most productive meeting I thought we've had all year. It was great. It was really good. I feel like today was a little bit of interest, amazing quality. But I don't think we're done yet. So those are my thoughts. Not about to speak for you. I apologize if I did, but that's my thoughts.
I agree. I feel like we do just need that opportunity to have some of the discussions that couldn't take place today, to flesh out and make sure that we are all in agreement and on the same page on some of those areas.
At the risk of sounding self-serving, because I drive 2 hours to come to these meetings, I don't think that we need another meeting in December. I mean, quite frankly, if we just follow the rules as they're listed here, in the spirit that they were written and the way they're agreed upon, we shouldn't have any problems.
And that was my other, I mentioned to Brad, I said, do we come back at the beginning of the next meeting and reaffirm that we're following these and start there, or do we?
These are in effect. There's nothing, there's no reason that's valid not to follow them now. I mean, we have enforcement measures for if they're not being followed. So everything we need to effectively get through a December 20th meeting is here if everyone will just recommit to following the rules.
I'd like to comment on that. I agree wholeheartedly that we have rules. I would like to see the conversation continue so the kind of relationship building that just within the core of the meetings, there are places where the rules don't speak. We didn't talk today about, for example, are we following Robert rules? If so, what's the point for adjourning a meeting properly? That's not addressed in the procedure. So I think with more conversation, I do think it's been great. I do appreciate
for coming today, and I agree that we've had a productive meeting. And thanks NASB and thanks Luke for coming and answering our questions. Thank you very much.
Move to adjourn.
No.